What's good, YouTube? This is Who Is Like God, and in this video we're going to be debunking the idea that Jesus was human sacrifice. This is an argument that comes from Old Testament only or Tanakh only individuals, whether they be mainstream Jews or within the black community, Tanakh only Israelites, and I'm doing a lot that I can to actually reach out to this community based on principles from the Hebrew scriptures. The argument basically goes that Christians believe Jesus made an atonement by his blood, so if he was sacrificed, well, the Torah expressly forbids human sacrifice. So how can Jesus be valid and be valid ministry from God when he dies and is sacrificed when God hates that kind of sacrifice? Well, this is where we need to be really intricate and actually look at things Hebraically. The very first verse I'm going to bring you to is how Moses actually vindicates this type of ministry. So when you go and make Jesus a human sacrifice and say the Torah forbids it, you're actually going against what Moses himself did in the book of Exodus. Exodus, I believe this is Exodus 30 or 32, verse 30. The next day Moses said to the people, "You have sinned a great sin, and now I'll go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." So Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." So the long and short is Moses is essentially offering himself up as a ransom in the place of the children of Israel. This is exactly what Christians or messianics believe Christ did to make himself a ransom for the sins of Israel and the world. Understand the ministry that Christ came and prepared is exactly what Moses planned to do, what Moses was willing to do right here in the Torah. The word for atonement is the word that it means covering. So the idea is when you sin, there's a need for that sin, that transgression to be covered. And the word for atonement is used both in the Torah for the ritualistic sense of all the various offerings, sacrifices they would make to cover individual sins, but also outside of that, there are different means outside of just animal sacrifices where that covering, that atonement is made, that judgment is satisfied, as we can see with Phineas in that situation where the same word is also used. But that's the word that Moses is using. The same context of Israel's sacrificial system. Moses is saying the sin of idolatry, the great sin of idolatry, I'm going to try to make atonement for you. Lord, take me instead. Take me as a ransom. I'm innocent. They're guilty. Take me in their place so that they may be forgiven. And God actually rejects Moses' offer. But this is the exact same ministry that Christ claimed to make when he was here. And if there's a precedent for that, then we can't just rebuke Christ because this is a very Hebraic idea. Now, there's more to say, but the first point I want to make is that this is part of why we should take Isaiah 53 at face value. When I was debating the Tanakh only gentleman, he was making the point that Isaiah 53 can't be about a suffering servant, because if it was, we'd have to automatically disqualify it because the Torah forbids human sacrifice. Now, first of all, I think there's a hermeneutical inconsistency with that. What we have to try to do is be as objective as possible with each passage and then try to harmonize it within the entire context of Scripture. Where you have a presupposition, you're coming in with something that doesn't let you take the text at face value, that's a bad way to operate. Because we have to treat God's revelation with so much respect that we have to let it say what it says. At face value, a servant is suffering for the sins of Israel in Isaiah 53. At face value, no matter even if you want to say it's a collective, they're suffering for sin. They're suffering in the place of others. There's a ransom being done in exchange for the guilty party. But because of examples like Moses, where Moses offers to give himself up as a ransom in the exchange of the sinful party, that we should take this Isaiah 53 at face value. Even if you don't want to say it's about Jesus, there are people who actually identify Isaiah 53 with Moses among Jews, among Israelites, and the reason is actually because of the very verse I read, because there's a precedent for Moses willing to give himself up so that the sinful Israelites may be forgiven. See, the reality is this: human sacrifice is forbidden. But what is specifically forbidden in the Torah is offering up children to other gods or offering up your own children to God. So don't offer up your children to other gods or to the true God. That's what's specifically condemned in the Torah. But if there's a distinction to be made between what That is in between what Moses was doing, when Moses is sort of honored and looked up as this noble man because he was willing to put himself out for the sake of his people. If that distinction is there made with that, you have to make that distinction with Jesus. Because you can't point the finger and say Jesus is human sacrifice when Moses was willing to do the same thing thousands of years beforehand. If the distinction is to be made between human sacrifice and the death of the righteous atoning, you got to keep it 100. You got to keep it consistent. Because to point the finger at Jesus and call that human sacrifice, well, this is in the Tanakh, is actually using the double standard when both ideas is Hebraic. The point is this, is that Hebraically, the death of the righteous atones. This is a Hebraic concept. We can see Moses was the foundation of this. We see the earliest examples with Moses, but there's other stuff in the Tanakh as well as Israelite history. For example, Genesis 3, we get the first picture of the descendant of Eve confronting the serpent. We know the serpent is a spiritual entity when you look at it from an ancient Israelite lens, the Seraph type of entity, the Nahash entity. All right? And from the very beginning, the righteous descendant of Eve who defeats the serpent, it's a mutual collision because the serpent bites the human's heel and the human crushes the serpent's head. So from the very beginning, the prediction of redemption is a mutual collision between good and evil in the Tanakh. So let's put all this together. We have a mutual collision between evil and good, where good is inflicted harm to overcome evil. We have that. We have Moses willing to give himself up as a ransom for the children of Israel. We have that. And then we have Isaiah 53, which predicts that one is going to die for the sake of the sins of his people. People don't want to take that interpretation. But because of the first two things in the Torah, in the Tanakh, we should take the interpretation at face value. We can't stop ourselves from taking that face value reading when we have this Hebraic idea that the good overcomes evil by suffering and by giving yourself up as a ransom for the righteous, which is exactly what we believe with Christ. And maybe we're saying that there's different atonement theories as well when it comes to Christ's work on the cross, but the one that I've been studying recently and have been flirting with is ransom theory, which has historical precedent within the community of believers, but also Jesus directly said, I give myself up as a ransom for many. So Christ is suffering in the place of us, and that ransom is being paid. To whom is debated, but the ransom is being paid just like Moses was going to give himself up to satisfy God's wrath against the Israelites. So too is this what we believe in the ministry of Christ. You don't have to believe it, but characterizing it as human sacrifice, again, is being intellectually dishonest or innocently not knowing that the same concept is already in the Tanakh. But it goes beyond just what we have in the Torah. It's in Israelite history. This is exactly the kind of thing that we have in the book of Maccabees. When the Israelites were being slaughtered for keeping their covenant, they saw themselves as their deaths making atonement for Israel. Is that human sacrifice? Of course not. Human sacrifice is what we have with Japheth. Offering up a human being, your child, to a different God or to the true God is forbidden. This is what's forbidden in the Torah, and we can't play fast and loose with that because there's the clear difference between that and when a righteous person does die, by whatever means they die, that having atoning power. That is a Hebraic concept that we can see with Genesis 3, the descendant of Eve, with Moses, and with the Maccabees. This is from the book of 2 Maccabees in chapter 7. Now, this is when various children of one mother, they were being executed because they weren't going to forsake God. They weren't going to forsake the customs of the Torah. They were going to stay fast in their covenant and willing to die instead of forsaking God. This is what it says in verse 37. Like my brothers, I offer up my body and my life for our ancestral laws, imploring God to show mercy soon to our nation and by afflictions and blows to make you confess that he alone is God. Through me and my brothers, may there be an end to the wrath of the Almighty that has justly fallen on our whole nation. Here we have these children being executed in front of their mother, and as before the last one is killed, he says, I'm going to die because I'd rather die than give up the covenant of my God, and I pray that this satisfies the judgment that has justly come upon the nation. So Israel is saying, we have sinned, we deserve this judgment, may our deaths provide an atonement and satisfy the wrath of God so that this may end, so that you may know who is the true God. He's speaking to the Greek oppressors. This is the kind of ransom thinking that we have. This type of ransom theology where the death of the righteous atones in the place of the wicked, in the place of the nation. Shoot, even Caiaphas himself says this, where he says it's better that one man should die rather than the whole nation, when he's about to, Pharisees actually start moving to get Christ crucified in the New Testament. But it's not just 2 Maccabees, it's 4 Maccabees. 4 Maccabees chapter 6 verses 26 to 28. When he was now burned to his very bones and about to expire, he lifted up his eyes to God and said, "You know, O God, that though I might have saved myself, I am dying in burning torments for the sake of the law. Be merciful to your people, and let our punishment suffice for them. Make my blood their purification, and take my life in exchange for theirs." 4 Maccabees 17:20 to 22. These then, who have been consecrated for the sake of God, are honored not only with this honor, but also by the fact that because of them our enemies did not rule over our nation, the tyrant was punished, and the homeland purified, they having become, as it were, a ransom for the sin of our nation, a ransom for the sin of our nation. And through their blood of those devout ones, and their death as an atoning sacrifice, divine providence preserved Israel that previously had been mistreated. All this shows that it's a fully Hebraic thought where the death of the righteous atones. When the righteous are killed in the place of the nation, that has an atoning power where their life is a ransom in the place of the wicked. In the book of Maccabees, the martyrs who died for their faith, which these martyrs, these Maccabean martyrs who are actually exalted in various high churches, like the Roman Catholics and all these places, these memory of these Israelites who were willing to rather die than forsake their covenant. That is, and it's by these churches now that they're remembered primarily by Gentiles, honoring these ancient Israelites for keeping their covenant the world over. Their mentality was that hoping and praying that their death would provide an atonement. In the book of 4 Maccabees, it's actually that their death, that the judgment finishes on the nation of Israel because their life was ransomed in the place. So when you look at all of the sources in the Torah and in Israelite history, it is fully within Hebraic thought to believe that the death of the righteous atones, and that the death of the righteous is a legitimate ransom in the place of the wicked. Ancient Israelites were coming up with this idea based on when we can see all this stuff about this, the human servant and Moses can be seen in the Torah. So again, to call Jesus' sacrifice human sacrifice, when what the Torah specifically forbids is offering up children or innocent life to false gods or even the true God, sacrificing them. That distinction is there scripturally and Hebraically, that there's a difference between that and between offering up yourself as a ransom. So when we can see that, and we have Isaiah 53 in the Tanakh, this is exactly the ministry that we believe Jesus made and what Jesus was claiming to do. So to frame it as human sacrifice, when Moses was willing to do the same thing, when the Maccabees did the same thing, when the suffering servant in Genesis was predicted to do the same thing, and the servant in Isaiah was predicted to do the same thing, is wrong. To operate in a theology that's different from what ancient Israelites believed, and the ministry that Christ came to fulfill, and claimed to fulfill, in other words. Another thing is, a human sacrifice is obviously when one human sacrifices another, typically without that other person's consent, especially when there's an infant being killed. Christ offered himself up. He was perfectly obedient to the Father's will, but there was a conscious allowance on his part to be crucified. He said, if I wanted, I could have a legion of angels pick me up and save me, rather than the scriptures wouldn't be fulfilled. So there's a difference between this human sacrifice versus God in the flesh offering himself up as a ransom. Imagine how beautiful it is that throughout the history of Israel, there were righteous men and righteous martyrs who were willing to offer themselves up to satisfy God's judgment on the nation as a ransom. And just like that ransom was paid through their suffering and was believed to be in the minds and hearts of Israel, so too was Christ once and for all when it was God in the flesh. Imagine how beautiful it is, because we have this thought trajectory that goes back to the very beginning in the Torah, and then we have it culminating in God himself in flesh doing the exact same thing. It's beautiful when you put it like that. But this is a fully Hebraic thought. So I want to make this video to debunk this idea that Jesus is human sacrifice, when we actually understand what Jesus is doing and how that actually is exactly within the grid of what ancient Israelites believe. This continues on into the rabbinic stuff, but even before that period, while the temple still stood, in the 1st century and prior, these ideas were prevalent among the Israelite community. You see what I'm saying? 4 Maccabees directly says ransom and atoning sacrifice in the same verse. It's a beautiful thing. A righteous ransom in the place of the wicked isn't a human sacrifice. It's a beautiful act of self-sacrifice and righteousness and mercy that God honors. This is what we believe Jesus did, a descendant of David, before the temple was destroyed. Think about it, after the temple was destroyed, there's no opportunity for any ritual sacrifices. So imagine how logical it is that before that point, God would make the ultimate atonement by the death of the ultimate righteous. At the end of the day, we have to investigate Christ and see if his claims and testimonies are vindicated, because the belief system, once again, is totally Hebraic. And this is a point that I want us to get in the religious debate, especially between Christians and other Abrahamic faiths. I want to get to a point where we can all recognize how Hebraic the belief system is as a pretext to the debate around the personhood of Jesus. So y'all be blessing the Messiah, and I'll see you in the next one, all right? Peace.